A crisp October evening in rural Pennsylvania, 2008. The air held the metallic scent of falling leaves and the promise of a cold winter. It was a familiar feeling for Cecilia Dart, a seasoned officer of the Pennsylvania State Department, a rhythm she had known for 13 years. She was a woman carved from the quiet resolve of the landscape itself, dependable, meticulous, and deeply respected by her peers. Her routine was a carefully orchestrated ballet of duties: early mornings, diligent paperwork, patrolling the winding country roads, and the comforting predictability of her evening return home. Yet, in the weeks leading up to this particular autumn night, a subtle discord had crept into the usual harmony. A faint unease, like a barely perceptible tremor beneath the surface of a placid lake, had begun to disturb her typically unshakable calm. It was nothing she could pinpoint, no specific threat or overt sign, just a creeping sense that something was shifting, something just beyond the periphery of her awareness. She had dismissed it as the stress of the job, the everyday anxieties of upholding the law in a quiet corner of the world. But as she began her final shift, the last rays of sunlight painting long shadows across the patrol car dashboard, a shiver unrelated to the evening chill, traced its way down her spine. The engine hummed its familiar tune, the radio crackled with mundane dispatch calls, and the world outside seemed utterly normal. Yet, for Cecilia, the familiar suddenly felt fragile, as if suspended on the edge of an unseen precipice. This is the story of Cecilia Dart, a dedicated officer who vanished without a trace in 2008, only for her vehicle and a chilling secret to resurface a decade later in the heart of rural Texas. What truly happened to Cecilia? Stay with us until the very end to uncover the astonishing truth behind her disappearance. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? The clock on the dashboard of Cecilia Dart's patrol car read 10:17 p.m. as she completed her final patrol sweep of the quiet rural roads. A sense of weary satisfaction settled over her. Another shift done, another night of peace maintained in her corner of Pennsylvania. She had filed her routine reports electronically from the car, noting nothing out of the ordinary. The usual banter with dispatch had concluded, and the familiar route back to the station was empty, illuminated only by the pale gleam of her headlights on the asphalt. She often enjoyed these late-night drives, the solitude a welcome contrast to the day's demands. She thought of the warm, familiar comfort of her home, just 20 minutes away, and the quiet satisfaction of a hot cup of tea before bed. Her husband, David, would likely be asleep, but she imagined the silent comfort of his presence in the next room. But that night, the routine, so steadfast and reassuring, fractured. Cecilia never arrived home. Her call to David, a quick good night she always made upon leaving the station, never came. The usual text message, a simple ETA 10 mean, remained unsent. At first, David attributed it to a late call, an unexpected detour. He knew her dedication. But as the hours stretched into the early morning and the first birds began to chirp, a cold dread began to set in. He called the department, his voice tight with a fear he usually reserved for his worst nightmares. Dispatch confirmed she had signed off, her patrol car logged as returned to the station. But the car, a standard Ford Crown Victoria, badge number 458, sat silently in the darkened parking lot, exactly where she left it. Her personal vehicle, a modest sedan, remained untouched in her designated spot. It was as if she had simply evaporated from the face of the earth the moment she stepped out of her patrol car, leaving no ripple, no trace. The initial confusion quickly escalated into a full-scale search. Every available officer joined the effort, combing the department grounds, the surrounding streets, and the short route she would have taken home. K-9 units were brought in, their handlers meticulously guiding them through the chilly night. But the scent trails invariably led back to the department's entrance and then vanished into thin air. Every dumpster, every dark alley, every shadow was scrutinized. Neighbors were questioned, colleagues interviewed. But no one had seen anything, heard anything unusual. The silence was deafening, the lack of any obvious sign unnerving. Cecilia Dart, a woman of habit and precision, had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only an agonizing void and a growing stack of unanswered questions that hung heavy in the crisp October air. The case, once a flurry of activity, soon settled into a chilling stillness, becoming one of those cold files, whispered about but rarely revisited, a constant ache in the heart of a small Pennsylvania community. The initial fervor of the search for Cecilia Dart gradually faded, replaced by the grim reality of a cold case. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. The yellow crime scene tape that had once cordoned off the department parking lot was long gone, its vibrant hue replaced by the dull gray of concrete. The air that had once hummed with the urgent whispers of investigators now carried only the mundane sounds of daily police work. Life relentlessly moved on. For Cecilia's husband David, however, time became an endless, tormenting loop. Each morning brought the agonizing realization that she was still gone, each night a hollow space beside him in their bed. He had cooperated tirelessly with every lead, however faint, clung to every thread of hope offered by detectives, however fragile. He had endured the painful media attention, the sympathetic glances, the whispered conjectures, but eventually even the most persistent investigators had no new avenues to explore. The official report, thick with witness statements and dead ends, was eventually stamped inactive, a bureaucratic term that felt like a death sentence for any lingering hope. The department had done its due diligence, they said, but without a body, without a single compelling piece of evidence beyond her simply not returning home. There was nothing more to be done. It was a cruel paradox. She was gone, but officially she was merely missing. The quiet community of Cecilia's hometown, usually a bastion of neighborly support, found itself grappling with a unique kind of grief. There was no funeral to attend, no grave to visit, no collective closure. Instead, an unsettling uncertainty lingered, a silent question mark hanging over every familiar street. People spoke of her in hushed tones, remembered her laugh, her dedication, her unwavering professionalism. Some theorized, whispered about secret lives or vengeful criminals, but these were just the desperate attempts of a community to make sense of the incomprehensible. The prevailing sentiment was a deep, pervasive sadness, laced with a frustration that mirrored David's own. For the Pennsylvania State Department, Cecilia Dart's disappearance became a somber footnote in their history, a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of their work. New recruits joining in the subsequent years might hear hushed stories about the officer who simply vanished, a cautionary tale passed down in the quiet moments between shifts. Her photograph, once prominently displayed in the briefing room, eventually found a quieter spot, a faded reminder on a wall of fallen heroes and unresolved mysteries. The file, thick and dusty, resided in a locked cabinet in the archives, its contents rarely disturbed. The cold case unit would occasionally review it, a routine check for new technologies or overlooked details, but each review yielded the same disheartening result: no new leads, no fresh perspectives. David, meanwhile, had learned to navigate a life shrouded in absence. He kept her favorite armchair in the living room, a silent monument to her memory. He had, with time, packed away some of her belongings, unable to bear the constant reminders, yet unwilling to fully erase her presence. He lived with the constant, dull ache of not knowing, a wound that refused to heal because it was never truly cleaned. The anniversaries of her disappearance were the hardest, each October a bleak reminder of that crisp, fateful night. 10 years passed, a decade marked by an enduring silence that stretched from the quiet streets of Pennsylvania across the vast expanse of the American landscape, a silence that seemed destined to persist forever. No one truly expected to hear from Cecilia Dart again, and the world had moved on, leaving her story suspended in an agonizing state of limbo, a forgotten whisper on the wind. Until, that is, the phone call. A call from a place so distant, so seemingly unconnected, that it defied all logic and expectation, a call that would rip open old wounds and shatter the decade-long silence. 10 years is a long time for a secret to lie buried, for a hope to remain dormant. For David Dart, and for the dwindling few who still remembered Cecilia, the passage of a decade had solidified the agonizing belief that she was simply gone, lost to the unforgiving currents of time and mystery. The world had largely forgotten the name Cecilia Dart, or perhaps relegated it to the category of unsolved local lore. But the earth, as some would say, has its own memory, and sometimes its memory is jogged by the most innocuous of events in the most unlikely of places. It was May of 2018, a sweltering spring in rural West Texas, a land of vast, sun-baked plains, thorny mesquite, and a silence so profound it could swallow a person whole. A local rancher, grizzled and accustomed to the solitary rhythms of his land, was checking fence lines after a particularly aggressive flash flood. The rain-swollen arroyos, usually dry gashes in the landscape, had reshaped the terrain, exposing forgotten things. As his battered pickup truck rattled along a rarely used access road, he spotted something glinting in the newly eroded earth near a deep, overgrown ravine. It was a faint, unnatural shimmer, out of place amidst the muted greens and browns of the scrubland. Curiosity, a trait common to those who live it in isolation, compelled him to investigate. He killed the engine, the sudden silence of the Texas wilderness enveloping him, broken only by the buzz of cicadas. Approaching on foot, kicking through thick brush and loose red soil, the outline became clearer, more defined. It was a car, or what was left of one. Half buried in the clay and tangled roots, tilted at a precarious angle, sat a sedan. Its exterior was a mosaic of rust and baked-on dust, its original color indistinguishable beneath the grime of years. The windows were opaque with dirt, and the tires, if they could still be called that, were deflated and rotting into the earth. It looked like a forgotten relic, another casualty of the harsh, indifferent landscape. He peered closer, wiping a sleeve across a side window, and saw the faint, faded outline of what appeared to be a standard license plate frame, though the plate itself was missing or obscured. There was no sign of a crash, no twisted metal or shattered glass that would indicate an accident. It seemed merely abandoned, slowly reclaimed by the unforgiving elements. He thought perhaps it belonged to some long-forgotten drifter, or was evidence of a low-level smuggling operation gone awry. He reached for his phone, a worn flip phone with poor reception, and with some effort managed to get a signal reporting the abandoned vehicle to the local sheriff's department. It was a routine call, one of many in a county where forgotten vehicles were a common sight. Within the hour, a single sheriff's deputy arrived, a young man still new to the vastness of the county. He circled the car cautiously, his brow furrowed in mild confusion. There was something about it that didn't quite fit the usual profile of a derelict vehicle. No obvious signs of forced entry, no telltale bullet holes. As he leaned closer, peering through the dirt-streaked windshield, he noticed a faded decal on the far corner of the glass, barely visible beneath the layers of grime. It was an official-looking emblem, though he couldn't quite make out the words. And then, as he knelt to inspect the driver's side door, his gaze fell upon a small, almost imperceptible detail near the lock. A faint, barely legible serial number etched into the metal. It was a specific identifier, unusual for a civilian vehicle. His training kicked in, a subtle alarm bell ringing in his mind. This was not just an abandoned car. This was something else entirely. He immediately called it in, requesting a more specialized unit, unknowingly setting in motion a chain of events that would pull a decade-old mystery from the depths of oblivion and send shockwaves far beyond the arid plains of Texas. The silence around the vehicle, once a sign of its abandonment, now felt heavy with an unspoken, dark history. The arrival of the specialized unit at the remote Texas ravine transformed the scene from a simple abandoned vehicle report into a meticulously orchestrated recovery operation. Forensics teams, with their precise movements and sterile equipment, descended upon the site like surgeons, each step calculated, each gesture deliberate. The deputy who had made the initial call watched, a mix of awe and trepidation washing over him as the gravity of his discovery began to sink in. The air, once still and heavy with the scent of dry earth, now hummed with the quiet intensity of professional inquiry. The sedan, partially excavated from its muddy tomb, slowly began to reveal its long-held secrets. Its exterior, once thought to be an indeterminate color, was painstakingly cleaned enough to confirm a faded dark blue finish, a standard color for unmarked police vehicles of that era. This was the first significant confirmation, immediately setting it apart from a typical civilian car. The faint emblem on the windshield, which the deputy had barely discerned, was carefully photographed and later enhanced, the official seal of the Pennsylvania State Department, unmistakably clear. A shiver went through the team. This was no Texas local. This car had traveled a vast distance, carrying with it a mystery that spanned states and years. The process of opening the vehicle was handled with extreme caution. Every inch of the exterior was dusted for latent fingerprints, though the elements had largely erased any clear impressions. When the door was finally pried open, a wave of stagnant, musty air, heavy with the scent of decay and damp earth, wafted out. It was a smell that spoke of long abandonment, a confined space left to the mercy of time and humidity. Inside, the interior was a desolate landscape of faded upholstery, brittle plastic, and a thick layer of dust. The passage of a decade had taken its toll. Leather cracked, fabric shredded in places, and mildew bloomed in dark patches. Yet, amidst the desolation, carefully catalogued and photographed before removal, were the truly crucial details. On the passenger seat, half covered by a fallen sun visor, lay a small, leather-bound notebook. Its pages were warped and slightly discolored by moisture, but some of the handwritten entries, though faint, were still legible. It appeared to be a personal log, not official police documentation. Nearby, tucked into a torn map pocket on the driver's side door, was a single, well-worn car key, no longer attached to a fob, its metal dull with age. Its presence suggested a hasty departure, or perhaps an attempt to hide it. But the most chilling discovery came when the forensic technician, working meticulously in the cramped confines of the driver's footwell, found a dark, almost black stain on the worn carpet beneath a floor mat. It was a small area, barely a few inches across, but its irregular shape and dried, crusted texture immediately signaled its grim nature. A presumptive test was administered on site, and the results, though preliminary, sent a jolt through the team, positive for human blood. The presence of such a stain, despite the intervening years and exposure to the elements, indicated a significant event. A violent act had taken place within the vehicle. This wasn't merely an abandoned car, it was a crime scene, preserved by circumstance and the unforgiving Texas sun. The implications were profound and immediate. The Texas authorities, recognizing the multi-state nature of the case, swiftly contacted the Pennsylvania State Department. The news was met with a stunned disbelief, then a quiet, almost reverent awe. The name Cecilia Dart, once a painful whisper, was suddenly shouted into the present. The inactive file, gathering dust for years, was pulled from the archives, its contents meticulously reviewed. Photos of the recovered vehicle in Texas were cross-referenced with the last known images of Cecilia's personal car from 2008. The match was undeniable, absolute. It was her car. The discovery reignited a spark of desperate hope, mixed with a chilling certainty that the answers would not be pleasant. The case of Cecilia Dart, cold for a decade, was now violently, dramatically reopened. A small team of Pennsylvania investigators, including some who had been on the force when she vanished, were dispatched to Texas with an urgent mandate: uncover what truly happened to Officer Cecilia Dart. The silence that had enveloped her story for so long was about to be shattered, piece by agonizing piece, by the determined pursuit of truth across 2 states and 10 years of unanswered questions. The initial phone call from the Texas Sheriff's Department to the Pennsylvania State Department had been met with a mixture of shock and disbelief. For a decade, Cecilia Dart's name had been synonymous with an enduring, agonizing void. Now her car, an undeniable piece of her missing life, had surfaced thousands of miles away in the sun-baked desolation of West Texas. The news spread through the Pennsylvania Department like wildfire, igniting a forgotten anguish and a renewed sense of urgency. Old-timers who remembered Cecilia exchanged somber glances. Newer recruits who had only heard whispers of the cold case felt the weight of history settle upon them. Chief Investigator Robert Maxwell, a man whose tenure almost spanned Cecilia's entire career, took the call personally. His voice, usually calm and authoritative, was strained with an unfamiliar tremor as he listened to the detailed report from the Texas forensics team. The dark blue sedan, the faded Pennsylvania State Department decal, the serial number confirming it was indeed Cecilia's personal vehicle, and then the chilling detail, the bloodstain. It was a punch to the gut. For years, the department had grappled with the uncertainty of her fate. Now, a grim picture was beginning to emerge, painted in shades of rust and dried blood. A small elite team was immediately assembled to travel to Texas, spearheaded by Detective Lena Hansen. Hansen was a rising star in the department, known for her sharp intellect and tenacious pursuit of truth, even when the trail was cold. She hadn't been on the force when Cecilia disappeared, but she had studied the cold case file religiously, feeling a silent connection to the missing officer. She packed her bag with a grim determination, the weight of a decade of unanswered questions pressing down on her shoulders. Alongside her traveled a seasoned forensic specialist and a veteran homicide detective, both quiet, focused, and acutely aware of the historical significance of their mission. Upon their arrival in Texas, the dry, stark landscape was a stark contrast to the verdant rolling hills of Pennsylvania. The Texas authorities greeted them with a somber respect, fully grasping the emotional magnitude of the discovery. Hansen walked the scene, her eyes scanning every detail, imagining the desperate final moments that might have occurred within the confines of that rusted shell. The car, now meticulously documented and prepared for transport, was a silent testament to a life brutally interrupted. The immediate questions were manifold, each one opening a new abyss of uncertainty. Why was Cecilia's personal vehicle in West Texas? The distance alone was staggering, over 1,800 miles, a journey that would take days. Had she driven it herself? If so, why? Was she on official business, an undercover operation that went catastrophically wrong? Or was she abducted, her car used as a means of transportation by her assailants? The presence of her personal vehicle, rather than her patrol car which had been left at the department, suggested something outside of her regular duties, something perhaps unscheduled and deeply personal. The initial investigation in 2008 had been thorough, but constrained by the lack of any physical evidence. Now, with the car and the blood, new avenues opened up. The forensic team in Texas began the painstaking process of DNA analysis on the bloodstain, working in tandem with the Pennsylvania team to cross-reference it with Cecilia's known DNA profile. Simultaneously, the notebook found in the car was being carefully examined. Its pages, fragile and water-damaged, held the potential to unlock vital clues, perhaps even the last thoughts or observations of Cecilia Dart. Back in Pennsylvania, while Hansen's team was in Texas, other officers were tasked with a crucial re-examination of the old files. They pulled Cecilia's personal and professional records, looking for any overlooked detail, any anomaly, any connection to Texas or the Southwest. Who were her contacts? Had she ever expressed an interest in or planned a trip to that region? Did she have any family or friends there, however distant? Every phone record, every email, every financial transaction from the months leading up to her disappearance was painstakingly re-scrutinized. The task was enormous, like sifting through mountains of sand for a single, elusive grain. The collective efforts of both departments coalesced around a central, unnerving hypothesis. Cecilia Dart's disappearance was no mere missing person case. The vehicle's location, the blood, and the decade of silence strongly suggested foul play. But who would want to harm a quiet, dedicated officer? And why would her body, if indeed she was deceased, never be found, even with her car discovered? The questions hung heavy in the air, echoing across two states, binding two distinct landscapes in a shared, chilling mystery. The first clues had been found, but they only served to deepen the enigma, pulling the investigators further into a labyrinth of uncertainty, compelling them to delve into Cecilia's past with an unprecedented intensity. The truth, they knew, was waiting, buried beneath layers of time and dust, somewhere between Pennsylvania and Texas. With Cecilia Dart's car now a secured piece of evidence and the initial shock wearing off, the investigation shifted from the immediate present to a forensic deep dive into the past. Detective Lena Hansen, her team, and the Texas authorities began the arduous task of piecing together the fragmented narrative of Cecilia's final months and days. It was a painstaking process, like trying to reconstruct a faded photograph from scattered, damaged pixels. The recovered notebook, initially deemed a personal log, quickly became a focal point. Handled with extreme care, its water-damaged pages were meticulously dried and preserved. Its contents, written in Cecilia's neat, precise hand, weren't a diary in the traditional sense, but rather a series of observations, notes from informal meetings, and coded entries that hinted at a deeper, more unsettling undercurrent in her professional life. Many entries were mundane, reminders for errands, thoughts on local events, but interspersed were curious notations, names, dates, and cryptic references to the project or the discrepancies. There were subtle allusions to irregularities in certain departmental procedures, particularly concerning resource allocation and procurement contracts. Nothing overtly incriminating, but enough to prick the seasoned investigator's attention. These weren't the notes of an officer simply performing her routine duties. They were the observations of someone looking closely, perhaps too closely, at something that didn't quite add up. Simultaneously, back in Pennsylvania, Chief Investigator Maxwell ordered a complete re-examination of all departmental records from 2007 and 2008. Every incident report, every expenditure request, every internal memo that bore Cecilia Dart's signature or was related to her assignments during that period was pulled. This was a monumental undertaking, sifting through mountains of paperwork that had long been filed away, considered resolved, or simply forgotten. The initial investigation in 2008 had focused on her disappearance as a standalone event, a sudden anomaly. Now, the new evidence from Texas forced them to consider a more insidious narrative, that her disappearance might have been the culmination of a deeper, pre-existing conflict or discovery. One of the first significant, albeit subtle details emerged from a review of maintenance logs for patrol vehicles. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Cecilia had submitted several requests for minor repairs that seemed disproportionate to the vehicle's age. Nothing major, just persistent issues with the GPS system, the radio, or odd electrical glitches. At the time, they were dismissed as typical wear and tear. Now, viewed through the lens of suspicion, they took on a different meaning. Could these have been attempts to tamper with her equipment, or was she noticing things that indicated surveillance or interference? Further investigation into her personal life, discreetly conducted, yielded nothing overtly suspicious. Cecilia was known for her quiet life, her dedication to her work, and her strong moral compass. She had no known enemies, no significant debts, no secret lovers. Her routine was consistent, her character beyond reproach. This only deepened the enigma. If her disappearance wasn't tied to a personal failing or a random act of violence, then the answer must lie within her professional sphere, perhaps in the very department she served. The financial records proved equally perplexing. A few small, unusual transactions were flagged in the months before her disappearance, not large sums, but transfers to an unfamiliar, obscure account in an adjacent county. When investigators traced the account, they found it was a shell corporation, ostensibly for agricultural services, but with no discernible legitimate activity. This was a significant deviation from Cecilia's otherwise meticulous financial habits, a small, uncharacteristic ripple in her otherwise calm financial waters. Was she moving money? Or was she investigating someone who was? The implication was unsettling. Perhaps Cecilia was involved in something that stretched beyond her daily patrol duties, something she had kept hidden, even from her closest colleagues. Hansen, poring over the copies of Cecilia's notebook entries, found a recurring name, Barnaby. There was no Barnaby listed in the department's current roster, nor in any of Cecilia's official contact lists. The notes associated with Barnaby were the most cryptic, often followed by question marks or underlined phrases like the schedule or the deliveries. This name, elusive and unconnected, felt like a key, a missing piece to a puzzle they were only just beginning to assemble. The overwhelming conclusion was that Cecilia Dart had stumbled upon something significant, something dangerous, within the scope of her work, or perhaps tangential to it. Her meticulous nature, which had once been a source of quiet admiration, was now seen as the very trait that might have led to her demise. She hadn't just vanished, she had been made to vanish. The clues, once dismissed as inconsequential, now took on a chilling new significance. The investigation pivoted from merely finding out where Cecilia was, to uncovering what she had discovered, and who had gone to such extreme lengths to silence her. The ghost of Cecilia Dart, once a specter of sadness, now became a haunting presence, urging them forward deeper into the murky waters of a past carefully obscured. The threads of truth, subtle and elusive, were finally beginning to emerge from the decade of silence, promising a painful but necessary revelation. As Detective Hansen and her team delved deeper into the recovered notebook and the re-examined departmental records, a pattern began to emerge, subtly at first, then with increasing clarity. The discrepancies Cecilia had meticulously noted were not random. They revolved around a series of state contracts awarded to a small, relatively unknown construction firm, Apex Solutions, for infrastructure upgrades in rural areas of Pennsylvania. These contracts, involving road repairs, bridge maintenance, and public building renovations, had consistently gone to Apex Solutions, even when larger, more established companies offered more competitive bids. At the time, such decisions were often attributed to local politics or established relationships. But Cecilia's notes hinted at something more deliberate, more illicit. Cecilia's entries weren't accusations, but rather a series of probing questions. Why Apex? Cost overruns consistently. Material quality. She had cross-referenced public records, noting the seemingly arbitrary changes in project scopes that inevitably led to increased budgets for Apex. Her meticulous nature, once merely a commendable trait, now appeared as a quiet, relentless pursuit of truth. She hadn't been screaming about corruption. She had been gathering data, building a case, piece by painstaking piece, in the margins of her daily life. The name Barnaby, initially a puzzling enigma from her notebook, finally found a chilling context. Through cross-referencing obscure public records and old local newspaper archives, investigators discovered a distant cousin of Cecilia's, a man named Arthur Barnaby, who had briefly worked for Apex Solutions as a site supervisor during the period in question. Arthur had a history of minor legal troubles and a reputation for being tight-lipped. He had left Apex abruptly just weeks before Cecilia's disappearance and moved out of state, leaving no forwarding address. The link was tenuous, but compelling. Had Cecilia been discreetly communicating with her cousin, perhaps trying to gather inside information about Apex's practices? Was Arthur Barnaby her source, a conduit to the darker secrets of the company? The financial anomalies flagged in Chapter 7 also began to make sense. The obscure shell corporation, ostensibly for agricultural services, was in fact a front, a conduit for illicit payments. Tracing the flow of money, though difficult due to layers of obfuscation, revealed a complex web of transactions that ultimately led back to several high-ranking officials within the very state procurement office responsible for awarding these contracts. The amounts were not exorbitant on an individual basis, but collectively they indicated a systematic scheme of kickbacks and inflated invoices. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a carefully constructed network of corruption. This discovery painted a grim picture. Cecilia Dart, a conscientious and morally upright officer, had likely stumbled upon a deep-seated corruption scheme that reached into the upper echelons of state bureaucracy, possibly even touching figures within her own extended professional sphere. Her deviations from routine, the unusual transactions, and her cryptic notes were not signs of her complicity, but rather evidence of her independent, quiet investigation. She wasn't just patrolling roads, she was policing the very system she served. The motive for her disappearance suddenly became terrifyingly clear. She was a threat. Her integrity, her meticulousness, and her quiet persistence made her an unwitting yet formidable adversary to those profiting from the scheme. She wasn't a reckless whistleblower. She was an intelligent, methodical gatherer of facts, which made her all the more dangerous to those who wanted their secrets to remain buried. They hadn't needed to silence a loudmouth. They needed to erase a quiet observer who saw too much. The question then shifted from why she was targeted to who had orchestrated her disappearance and how they had managed to transport her and her vehicle across the country without a trace. The fact that her personal car, not her patrol vehicle, was used was significant. It suggested that she might have been lured or forced into her own car, taken off the grid without drawing immediate attention. The corruption scheme itself might not have been violent by nature, but the discovery of it and the potential exposure could easily drive desperate people to desperate acts. The investigators felt a chilling wave of realization. Cecilia Dart hadn't been a random victim of crime. She had been targeted, systematically eliminated, because she had dared to look closer, to question what others accepted. The truth was not just tragic, it was a betrayal from within, a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers lay not in the shadows of society, but in the polished offices of power. The road ahead was clear, but treacherous. They now had to identify the perpetrators, dismantle their network, and finally bring justice to Cecilia Dart, whose quiet pursuit of integrity had cost her everything. The vast, empty expanse of Texas, where her secrets had finally surfaced, now felt intimately connected to the hidden depths of corruption in Pennsylvania. The revelation of a sophisticated corruption scheme as the likely motive for Cecilia Dart's disappearance electrified the investigation, but it also presented a formidable new challenge. Unlike a typical criminal case with clear perpetrators and victims, this involved powerful, entrenched figures, protected by layers of bureaucracy and influence. Detective Lena Hansen understood that exposing such a network would require more than just forensic evidence. It would demand breaking a carefully constructed wall of silence, a wall built from fear, loyalty, and self-preservation. Their primary focus shifted to identifying and interviewing individuals who might have had knowledge of the Apex Solutions scheme or Cecilia's inquiries, particularly those who had since left the state or retired. Arthur Barnaby, Cecilia's elusive cousin, became the immediate priority. Tracking him down proved difficult. He had moved frequently, his digital footprint almost non-existent. Eventually, a diligent search through old property records and utility bills led them to a quiet, unassuming town in upstate New York. Hansen and her team traveled there, hoping that the passage of a decade might have softened his resolve or eased his fears. They found Barnaby living a meager, isolated life, working odd jobs. He was a man hardened by struggle, his eyes holding a haunted, guarded look. When confronted with Cecilia's name and the details of Apex Solutions, a flicker of fear, quickly masked, crossed his face. He initially denied any knowledge, claiming he barely remembered his cousin and knew nothing of the construction company's inner workings. His resistance was palpable, a wall of evasion built from years of ingrained caution. Hansen, employing a combination of empathy and unwavering resolve, gently pressed him, laying out the emerging facts of the corruption and the strong possibility that Cecilia had paid the ultimate price for exposing it. She spoke of Cecilia's dedication, her integrity, and the decade of suffering endured by her family. Slowly, painstakingly, Barnaby's defenses began to crumble. He admitted that Cecilia had contacted him months before her disappearance, expressing concerns about irregularities at Apex. He confessed to providing her with some internal documents, timesheets, material invoices, and communication logs that revealed significant discrepancies and inflated costs. He described a culture of intimidation within the company, hinting at threats from powerful individuals connected to the state contracts. He had been terrified, he admitted, which was why he had fled, convinced that silence was his only path to survival. His testimony, though reluctant, provided crucial confirmation of Cecilia's suspicions and further solidified the link between her disappearance and the corruption. He could not, however, offer any direct knowledge of her abduction or what happened to her afterward. He had simply run when the pressure became too great. Parallel to their pursuit of Barnaby, the team began reaching out to former employees of the Pennsylvania State Department who had retired around 2008. These individuals were less directly involved in the Apex scheme, but had been privy to the department's internal dynamics during Cecilia's tenure. Many were initially wary, their loyalty to the institution deeply ingrained. Some claimed memory loss, others expressed a reluctance to stir up old ghosts. There was a palpable sense of apprehension, a quiet agreement not to speak ill of the past. One former administrative assistant, Martha Ellison, a woman in her late 60s who had retired to Florida, proved more cooperative, though still cautious. She remembered Cecilia as a straight arrow who sometimes asked too many questions about budget allocations and vendor selections. Ellison recalled a specific incident just weeks before Cecilia vanished, when she had seen Cecilia in a heated, hushed conversation with a high-ranking official from the state procurement office, a man named Marcus Thorne. Thorne had a reputation for being ruthless and politically connected. Ellison couldn't hear the specifics of their conversation, but the tension in the room had been unmistakable, and Cecilia had left looking visibly shaken. This was a critical piece of the puzzle, directly linking Cecilia's investigations to a specific, powerful individual. Ellison confessed that she had been too afraid to say anything at the time, fearing repercussions to her own career and pension. Now, a decade later, the weight of her silence had become too heavy to bear. The resistance, both from Barnaby and the former department employees, was not malicious. It was born of fear, a testament to the power and reach of the individuals involved in the corruption. It became clear that Cecilia had been operating in a dangerous, politically charged environment, and her relentless pursuit of truth had made her a liability to those who thrived in the shadows. The investigators now had names, connections, and a clearer understanding of the forces arrayed against Cecilia. The hunt for ghosts was yielding unsettling truths, each revelation painting a clearer, grimmer picture of the deep-seated corruption that had silently devoured one of their own. The wall of silence, though formidable, was finally beginning to show cracks, promising that the truth, however painful, would eventually come to light. With Arthur Barnaby's reluctant confession and Martha Ellison's crucial recollection of the heated exchange with Marcus Thorne, the investigators now had a clear target. Marcus Thorne, a man whose career had flourished during the decade of Cecilia's disappearance, was the logical nexus of the corruption scheme and, by extension, the most probable orchestrator of her vanishing. But proving it and finding Cecilia's remains were two vastly different challenges. They had a motive and a primary suspect, but the physical evidence linking Thorne directly to Cecilia's abduction remained elusive. Detective Hansen returned to the bloodstain found in Cecilia's car, now meticulously analyzed by the Texas Forensics Lab. The DNA profile from the blood was confirmed to be Cecilia Dart's. This solidified the fact that a violent act had occurred within her vehicle, confirming the worst fears. However, there was a second, smaller, fainter DNA profile also present in the vehicle, likely a secondary contact trace. It was insufficient for a full match, but it provided a partial profile. This was a critical lead, a silent witness from the past, indicating the presence of at least one other individual in the car during the violent encounter. The focus shifted to Thorne's movements and activities around October 2008. His official schedule from that period, painstakingly recreated from archives, showed a personal leave for 3 days immediately following Cecilia's disappearance. It was a common enough practice, but in light of the new evidence, it screamed suspicion. His cell phone records from that time, if they still existed, would be almost impossible to retrieve in full detail, but call logs between Thorne and Apex Solutions executives during the preceding months painted a picture of increasingly frequent and urgent communications. These calls abruptly ceased after Cecilia's disappearance. Investigators revisited the obscure shell corporation linked to the financial anomalies in Cecilia's records. Armed with the new information, they peeled back layers of corporate filings and dummy directors. They discovered a single direct link. One of the Shell Corporation's registered agents was a distant relative of Marcus Thorne, a quiet, almost invisible man with no discernible wealth, but a consistent stream of unexplained income. This family connection was the final irrefutable thread connecting Thorne directly to the illicit financial network Cecilia had been investigating. The team then turned their attention to Thorne's property. Marcus Thorne owned a sprawling hunting lodge in a remote, heavily wooded area of central Pennsylvania, a property that had remained largely unexamined during the initial 2008 search, as it was far from Cecilia's known patrol routes. With a meticulously prepared search warrant, a team of officers, including K-9 units trained in human remains detection, descended upon the secluded property. The lodge itself was opulent, but the real interest lay in the vast, untamed wilderness surrounding it. The search was grueling, hampered by dense undergrowth and uneven terrain. Days turned into nights. Then, on the third day, a K-9 unit, a German shepherd named Ranger, working near a long-abandoned logging trail on the far reaches of the property, began to alert. The dog's behavior became frantic, digging at a specific spot beneath a thick canopy of old growth. The scent, though faint after a decade, was unmistakable to the trained animal. The forensic team moved in, carefully excavating the area. Beneath several feet of compacted earth and debris, they found it, a makeshift burial site, shallow and crude, designed for concealment rather than respect. What they unearthed were fragmented human remains, accompanied by remnants of clothing consistent with Cecilia Dart's off-duty attire from 2008. A small tarnished silver locket, a gift from her husband David, was found clutched in the skeletal fingers, unmistakable proof of identity. The DNA analysis that followed would confirm it definitively. These were the remains of Cecilia Dart. The decade-long search had finally reached its heartbreaking conclusion. The discovery brought a wave of profound sorrow, but also a fierce sense of vindication. Cecilia had been found. Her long journey, begun that fateful October night in Pennsylvania, and ending in a desolate Texas ravine, had led them back to the very place where her life had been so cruelly taken. The final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a grim but complete picture. Cecilia Dart had uncovered a corruption scheme, confronted one of its key players, Marcus Thorne, and had been summarily silenced and buried on his remote property. Her car had then been driven thousands of miles, a desperate attempt to create a false trail, a ghost vehicle meant to mislead and distract, to ensure her disappearance remained an unsolvable enigma. The arid plains of Texas had unknowingly held the key to her fate, a testament to the Earth's refusal to keep silent forever. The stage was now set for reckoning, a decade overdue. The discovery of Cecilia Dart's remains on Marcus Thorne's remote Pennsylvania property sent shockwaves through the department and the state. It was the grim, irrefutable proof they had sought for a decade, confirming their deepest suspicions. The immediate priority shifted from investigation to apprehension. Chief Investigator Robert Maxwell, haunted by Cecilia's ghost for so long, personally oversaw the meticulous planning of Thorne's arrest. They wanted no leaks, no opportunity for escape, no chance for him to destroy any remaining evidence. The arrest itself was executed with swift, decisive precision. Marcus Thorne, still holding his powerful position within the state procurement office, was apprehended early one morning as he arrived at his sprawling suburban home. He was met not by uniformed officers, but by plainclothes detectives, including Lena Hansen, who presented him with the warrant. His initial composure, a practiced mask of authority, cracked instantly upon seeing the somber, resolute faces of the investigators. He stammered, demanding to know the reason for his arrest, feigning ignorance. But when Hansen quietly uttered the name Cecilia Dart and mentioned the lodge, a profound silence descended, and the color drained from his face. He knew. Thorne was taken into custody without further incident, his usual swagger replaced by a defeated slump. The subsequent search of his home and offices yielded a trove of incriminating evidence, though carefully hidden. In a locked safe beneath his study floor, investigators found not only a ledger detailing illicit payments to and from the Apex Solutions Shell Corporation, but also a small personal diary kept by Thorne himself. Unlike Cecilia's meticulous notes, Thorne's entries were terse, almost devoid of emotion, yet chillingly direct. There were veiled references to the problem and the cleanup in late 2008, and mentions of moving the asset. While not a confession in explicit terms, the context of the ledger and the timing of the entries left no doubt as to his culpability. He had meticulously documented his corruption, believing himself untouchable. Further analysis of the partial DNA profile found in Cecilia's car, cross-referenced with a database of known associates of Thorne and Apex Solutions, finally yielded a match. The secondary profile belonged to a man named Dennis Finch, a former heavy equipment operator for Apex Solutions with a history of petty crime and a reputation for being a loyal, unquestioning enforcer. Finch, who had also seemingly vanished from the area shortly after Cecilia's disappearance, was tracked to a small isolated cabin in the Appalachian foothills. His arrest was more volatile. He resisted fiercely, clearly understanding the finality of his capture. Under intense interrogation, Finch, broken by the weight of the evidence and the sudden, unexpected resurfacing of the decade-old crime, finally confessed. He detailed how Thorne, realizing Cecilia was close to exposing their scheme, had lured her to a supposed off-the-record meeting at a secluded property connected to Apex, promising to discuss the discrepancies she had uncovered. When she arrived, Finch, acting under Thorne's direct orders, had confronted her in her car. A struggle ensued, brief and brutal, resulting in her death. They had panicked, Thorne orchestrating the cover-up. Finch described burying her on Thorne's remote hunting lodge property, a place so private and expansive they believed it would never be searched thoroughly. He then recounted how Thorne, in a desperate last-ditch effort to throw off any investigation, had instructed him to drive Cecilia's car to West Texas, a seemingly random and impossible distance, and abandon it in the most remote, impassable location he could find, hoping it would be lost forever in the vast wilderness, far from any conceivable link to Pennsylvania. The story was sickening in its cold calculation, a stark testament to the lengths desperate men would go to protect their illicit gains. The arrests of Marcus Thorne and Dennis Finch brought a wave of grim satisfaction to the Pennsylvania State Department. The pain of Cecilia's loss remained, but the festering wound of uncertainty had finally been cleansed. Justice, though delayed by 10 agonizing years, was now within reach. The intricate web of corruption, painstakingly spun and silently maintained, was finally unraveling, its architects exposed, their secrets dragged into the harsh light of truth. The ghost of Cecilia Dart, who had silently demanded justice for a decade, could now, at last, begin to rest. The next step would be the legal battle, a public reckoning that would force the details of her betrayal and murder into the open, ensuring that her sacrifice was not in vain. The news of Cecilia Dart's discovery and the subsequent arrests of Marcus Thorne and Dennis Finch reverberated far beyond the confines of the Pennsylvania State Department for David Dart, her husband. It was a moment of profound, conflicting emotions. For a decade he had lived with a ghost, a perpetual ache of not knowing. Now, the agonizing uncertainty was replaced by a brutal, undeniable truth. His Cecilia was gone, murdered, and buried in a shallow grave on a property owned by the very man who had overseen her corruption investigation. The grief, once dulled by the passage of time, returned with a fresh, sharp intensity, but it was now laced with a powerful sense of resolution. She was found. The dignified process of recovering Cecilia's remains from Thorne's property was handled with the utmost respect and care. Every bone fragment, every shred of fabric was meticulously collected, testament to the scientific precision that had brought her story to light. David was offered the chance to be present, but he declined, choosing instead to wait for the final official confirmation. He needed to remember her as she was, vibrant and alive, not as the tragic culmination of a decade-long crime. The official identification, based on dental records and the silver locket she wore, was delivered to him by Chief Investigator Maxwell and Detective Hansen, their faces etched with a shared sense of solemn triumph. With her remains recovered, Cecilia Dart could finally be brought home. The decision was made to hold a private, intimate service for her, away from the glare of the media that had once sensationalized her disappearance. It was a solemn affair, attended by her immediate family, a few close friends who had never given up hope, and a contingent of her former colleagues from the Pennsylvania State Department. The mood was heavy with sorrow, yet there was also a tangible sense of relief, of closure that had been denied for so long. The small, quiet church in her hometown, bathed in the soft glow of stained glass light, was filled with hushed whispers and the scent of lilies. David sat in the front row, his gaze fixed on the simple, elegant urn that contained his wife's ashes. He remembered her laugh, her quiet strength, her unwavering commitment to justice. He thought of that crisp October evening, the last time he saw her alive, unaware of the insidious forces that were already closing in. Her sacrifice, though unintended, had uncovered a truth that transcended her personal tragedy, exposing a deep-seated rot that might otherwise have continued unchecked. Chief Investigator Maxwell delivered a eulogy, his voice hoarse with emotion. He spoke not just of Cecilia the missing officer, but of Cecilia the dedicated public servant, the woman of integrity who had quietly, bravely, sought out injustice. He acknowledged the years of unanswered questions, the pain and the doubt, and thanked the tireless efforts of everyone involved in finally bringing her home. He concluded by reiterating the department's unwavering commitment to upholding the very principles Cecilia had embodied, a promise to honor her memory through their continued dedication to truth and justice. After the service, Cecilia Dart was laid to rest in a small, serene cemetery overlooking the rolling Pennsylvania hills she had once patrolled. Her grave marker bore her name, her years of life, and the simple, profound inscription, "She sought the truth." The burial was a quiet, dignified affair, a stark contrast to the dramatic circumstances of her discovery. The earth, which had held her secret for so long, now cradled her in peace. For David, watching the coffin lowered, it was an emotional reckoning. The emptiness was still there, a permanent void left by her absence, but it was no longer accompanied by the gnawing agony of not knowing. He could finally mourn her, truly mourn her, without the crushing weight of endless questions. Her return, though not in the way he had once desperately prayed for, brought a profound sense of completeness to a chapter of his life that had been tragically, painfully incomplete. Cecilia Dart had returned to Pennsylvania, not as a missing person, but as a testament to relentless truth, a symbol of justice finally served. Her story was a brutal reminder of the sacrifices made in the pursuit of integrity, and a promise that even the most carefully buried secrets can, with time and determination, be brought to light. The trial of Marcus Thorne and Dennis Finch unfolded with the grim solemnity befitting a case that had spanned a decade. The prosecution, led by a determined district attorney, meticulously presented the overwhelming evidence: the recovered vehicle, the DNA, Arthur Barnaby's reluctant testimony, Martha Ellison's critical observations, the damning financial ledgers, Thorne's self-incriminating diary, and finally, Finch's detailed confession. The courtroom, packed with media and members of the public, bore witness to the unveiling of a calculated act of violence born from the pursuit of illicit gain. Marcus Thorne, once a picture of polished authority, sat in the defendant's chair, his face pale, his demeanor shattered. He maintained his innocence with weak, unconvincing denials, but his lies crumbled under the weight of the evidence and Finch's direct testimony. Dennis Finch, less sophisticated and more easily broken, appeared resigned to his fate, his confession painting a chillingly vivid picture of Cecilia's final moments. The jury, after an emotional and intense deliberation, returned verdicts of guilty on all counts for both men. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally arrived. Marcus Thorne was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and Dennis Finch received a lengthy sentence for his direct role in the murder. The news brought a quiet wave of relief to the community and a profound sense of vindication to Cecilia's family and former colleagues. The resolution of Cecilia's case transcended the personal tragedy. It served as a stark public reminder that corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched or carefully concealed, could ultimately be exposed. The tentacles of the Apex Solutions scheme were further investigated, leading to the indictment and conviction of other lesser figures who had profited from the fraudulent contracts. The Pennsylvania State Department, though scarred by the betrayal from within, emerged from the ordeal with a renewed commitment to integrity and transparency. New internal audit procedures were implemented, and the case of Cecilia Dart became a mandatory part of officer training, a somber cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked power and the importance of unwavering moral courage. For David Dart, life would never be the same. The trial, while necessary, had reopened old wounds, forcing him to relive the agony of her disappearance and the horror of her death. But with the convictions, a new, more peaceful chapter began to unfold. The constant torment of not knowing had finally been laid to rest. He found solace in her memory, not as a victim, but as a hero. He visited her grave often, finding a quiet comfort in the serene cemetery, knowing she was finally at peace, surrounded by the hills she loved. He often saw her former colleagues there, paying their respects, ensuring her sacrifice would not be forgotten. The legacy of Cecilia Dart lived on, etched into the collective memory of the Pennsylvania State Department. Her story became a silent testament to the countless men and women in law enforcement who choose duty over comfort, truth over convenience, and the law over the insidious influence of those who seek to bend it for their own gain. She embodied the quiet strength required to uphold justice, even when confronting darkness within one's own system. Her relentless pursuit of integrity, though it cost her everything, ultimately brought down a corrupt network and solidified her place not just as a fallen officer, but as a beacon of principled conduct. In the quiet moments when the world seemed to forget, Cecilia Dart's spirit endured. Her story served as a potent reminder that the earth, despite attempts to bury the truth, never truly forgets. And neither do the people who refuse to let corruption win. Her legacy wasn't just about a cold case solved. It was about the enduring power of moral courage, a beacon for all who believe that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will always find its way into the light.